So let's get more on the United Nations Security Council emergency meeting today on the U.S. operation against Venezuela. We are joined now by Mikatekiso Kubayi, who's a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, as well as Professor Hennie Strydom, who's an international law expert at the University of Johannesburg. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program this evening. Mikatekiso, I'll start with you. Given the emergency Security Council meeting today following the U.S. military operation in Venezuela and also that much publicized capture of Nicolás Maduro, how does South Africa's call for a progressive outcome, how does it reflect its broader commitment to multilateralism, but also to international law? Mikatekiso? Okay, while we try and connect to Mikatekiso...
Please repeat that question. There was a break there. The transmission isn't so clear.
Oh, apologies for that. I'll try to sum it up very quickly. So given the emergency Security Council meeting today and also that military operation in Venezuela, but also the capture of Nicolás Maduro, how does South Africa's call, especially for a progressive outcome, how does this reflect its broader commitment to multilateralism, but also international law as well?
Yeah, look, the South Africa is very clear, on its, progressive internationalism, and it's certainly in line, with what many representatives that have argued in this evening's UN Security Council meeting, arguing from, the G77, and others, the non-aligned movement. South Africa's call is, very well in line, with, those positions, including that of the African Union. The challenge isn't so much, whether there's, some sort of alignment or misalignment, with expected progressive outcomes. But it's, actually whether or not, the United Council can actually do anything, in, the face of, this kind of, new, power, great power politics, if you like. This kind of aggression, is, something that, many of these countries, many of these members had not, quite expected, since, the Second World War, if you like, by the end of the Cold War, ushered in a new era where, many would have thought, that, the UN, would be, at the center of, most, if not all, international dispute, settlement, processes and so on. This is something, that has taken many of them, completely aback.
Professor Strydom, this is something that might have taken many members aback, but from an international law perspective, how might the U.S. action using military force to remove a sitting head of state without any authorization from the United Nations, I must say, how can this be evaluated under the UN's own charter of prohibition on the use of force?
Well, it's a clear violation of the UN Charter, and I think that was the common message brought by the states who argued, presented statements in the Security Council today as friends of the UN Charter. So, and many other commentators have stressed it, and I've done so on several occasions. So the justifications that the United States have put forward for its action are not real justifications. It can only use force in that nature when it's under threat of an imminent attack by another state. So the question about the drug charges, the terrorism, and all the other pretexts, they may have another function, but they cannot be used to justify an action of this kind. It's against the United Nations Charter.
Yeah. Mikatekiso, some may call these just trumped-up charges, but looking at Maduro's own response, he's pleaded not guilty to these charges. Any surprises there?
It's not a surprise, at all. And he says that to the court that he's been kidnapped, which is true. He has been kidnapped. The United States kidnapped, a sitting head of state, to take him, to a court. What if, say we play devil's advocate and, the court finds him not guilty? What then? They would have disrupted, a whole entire countries, by internal governance arrangements, and so on. And, apart from all of this, the United States itself has been arrogant, and blatant, brazen in saying, look, we want that oil. That oil belongs to us. That oil belongs to American companies that set up the industry in the first place, and so on and so forth. The United States has been, the Trump administration has been adamant that, look, there has to be, a sort of American presence felt, in the region, as, a regional hegemon, right? Evoking the Monroe Doctrine, and now they call it, what is it, the Monroe Doctrine, if you like, and so on. And they've made it very clear it's got nothing to do with narco, trafficking, drug trafficking. It has everything to do with Venezuelan oil and other minerals that it actually has, that it deems to be very strategic for its industrialization and its other purposes.
Yeah. Prof, we did mention earlier that South Africa has described the U.S. capture of Maduro as a violation of the UN Charter, but also Venezuela's own territorial integrity. Diplomatically for South Africa, what are the stakes for Pretoria in really pushing this narrative at the Security Council?
Well, it has been pushed, I think, and will be pushed by several other countries. South Africa is in a position to do the same. If I, look at statements already made, so it's clear where South Africa stands on this. So those are the arguments, I think, which most states will rely on in responding to the issue, although they may not do so explicitly, because I think that is the sort of unproblematic issue concerning the legality or not of the action taken by the United Nations, by the United States.
Staying with you a bit, Prof, how significant is this principle then of sovereign equality?
It is massively important because it's the edifice on which the whole concept of the non-use of force against another state is built. And it forms part of the whole framework that was established, in 1945 by the United Nations to prevent kind of antiques that we've seen in the past. So undermining that is creating a very dangerous world. And the same can be said of what Russia has done in Ukraine. It was a violation in clear terms of that very principle of the United Nations Charter.
Mr. Kubayi, considering South Africa's foreign policy emphasis, especially on sovereignty and non-interference, how does Pretoria then balance this stance, especially with global concerns about human rights, for instance, and democratic legitimacy in Venezuela?
Well, it's important to note, that the importance of the argument that Venezuela has every right, to determine its own political path, its own, political arrangement, and so on. It is not for anybody else outside, of Venezuela to determine for the Venezuelan people, what its internal processes, what its internal arrangements, ought to be. That's a point of departure, right? On the principle that, all, all states are, essentially equal, at least, within, under the United Nations, at least. So that is the first principle, and I think a very important principle to remember. That whether South Africa likes the Maduro government or it does not. Many countries, for instance, in the recent meeting that's currently happening right now of the Security Council, argue that no, but they are they're dictatorial, they are this, that, and the others. Others arguing that it's illegitimate. As of the July 2024 elections, and so on and so forth. But that's neither here nor there. The issue is, it is an internal, Venezuelan matter, and it's for the Venezuelan people to determine, what course, to be taken, to manage their own affairs, internal affairs. That's the first point. The second one, is that, in any event, Article 1, specifies the UN Charter, specifies that you have to seek peaceful means if That is the first thing that you try to do. The UN exists precisely, for that to, try and mitigate and find resolutions, to international disputes, and so on. And I agree with Professor Strydom. There's no reason or justification. And in fact, many, of the representatives in the meeting of the UNSC have argued that there's no reason or justification, for, the actions of the United States, and nearly all of them stick to the importance of respecting the UN Charter and international law, even those that said they do not recognize the legitimacy of the Maduro government.
Professor Strydom, I want to extend this theme a bit more. Legally, what are the implications, especially within the Security Council, when a permanent member like the US faces criticism for their actions over states or what other states view as illegal, particularly given the veto powers and political pressure that the US might face here?
Yeah, well, we sit with a very difficult situation and a very tragic one, which is partly responsible for the undermining of the powers of the Security Council and of the United Nations in general. And that is the exercise of the veto right by powerful states and permanent members. And we're talking here about the United States, and we're talking about Russia, and we're talking about China, who have used their position as permanent members frequently to undermine the functioning of the Security Council. So, and Russia is a clear example with the Ukraine invasion militarily and occupation of part of Ukraine's territory, where it used its veto power to prevent the Security Council decision. If we have a condemnatory resolution against the United States of America now, I can guarantee you that the United States will use its veto power to stop it in its tracks. So that is a flaw in the whole system. And I can't tell you tonight how this is going to change, if at all.
Yeah.
I'm very skeptical whether I can just mention a very important aspect, which have not featured in all the debates. My question is, what is the role of the regional bodies, the Organization of American States? They have a clear, direct responsibility to intervene in this matter and try and solve it peacefully. And the question is, why haven't they done so? Maybe they have, but maybe it was not effective. And if it was not effective, they will have to reconsider. And I think that is a perspective that we should not forget about.
Absolutely. And as we continue dissecting this issue, again, looking at South Africa's position, Mikatekiso, how might South Africa's position at the UN then impact its relationship with Western partners and key global South allies, particularly in BRICS, for instance, and other multilateral forums?
Well, the interesting thing about the arguments that have been presented this afternoon and early evening at the UNSC is that they display something that has been quite observed quite often in UN processes, where you have global South, mainly global South bloc, including the BRICS countries voting or at least presenting argument in one particular fashion, and or what you would call maybe say a Western bloc arguing something completely opposite of that. However, in this particular instance, even many of the US's own allies have admitted that look, we have to respect the UN Charter, right, and international law. So even if you, for instance, you do not like a Maduro government, and so on, you still have to respect the UN Charter. And so on. We must also not undermine, the enormous, the enormity of the power that the U.S. wields over many economies, including European economies as well, and the pressure that it can bring to bear on many of these, member states, of the UN Security Council, especially those that, are currently arguing or have argued, just now. At the UN Security Council meeting as well. Remember how the Trump administration started, its new term, tariffs, right, and punishment for anyone, and everyone that disagrees, with their agenda, and so on. So imagine, a small state such as, Trinidad and Tobago, deciding to say something like we condemn, this, flagrant, violation, of international law, and so on. Obviously, that wouldn't sit very well, with the Trump administration, and there would be repercussions, for that, right? And so on. So South Africa's position, with regards to the global South, the G77 and so on, South Africa's position is intact. Its relations are sound. It has literally stuck, to the non-aligned movement. It has essentially stuck, to the same script, the same principles, that all of them, have presented, at this evening's meeting.
Professor Strydom, as we look at international law once again, does customary international law offer any guidance on the legality, especially of capturing a foreign head of state outside the framework of armed conflict or authorized peace operations in a region?
Well, customary international has informed what we have in the Charter now. So customary international has been codified by the United Nations Charter. So it's one of the pillars on which that edifice has been built. And through which it found its way into the United Nations Charter. And it is equally valid in assessing a situation of this kind.
Yeah. We continue our discussion in a short while. We do have Mikatekiso Kubayi, who's a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, as well as Professor Hennie Strydom, who's an international law expert at the University of Johannesburg as well. They're continuing to offer their insights into this very contentious issue as the UN Security Council meets this evening as well. Welcome back. We continue our discussion, of course, looking into the U.S.'s military operation in Venezuela. Still with us this evening is Mikatekiso, as well as Professor Hennie Strydom, also giving us their insights on this contentious issue. Mikatekiso, continuing with you, with regional and global reactions, these range from condemnation to support. What message should a country like South Africa, for instance, then aim to send about regional stability and respect for sovereignty?
It's very important that South Africa continues on this path that it has argued, principally because you have seen recently military engagement in Nigeria, for instance. You have seen the threats made against South Africa and others. In fact, even the threats of even harsher, military engagement in Venezuela should, the current interim president, behave in a particular manner that they do not like, and so on. So it's important for South Africa to stay the course. It's absolutely vital. There's the implications of this military action is that no one currently the world over is safe. They've created a world of an environment of insecurity for essentially everybody, because it's a suggestion that at any given point in time, should they not like a particular government or a particular policy in any country, they can use their military, go in, extract an individual, a sitting head of state, and do the and do what they're currently doing to President Maduro. This can't be allowed to happen in the international order that we all of us want. So it's very important for South Africa to maintain its course, because it is correct. It is correct in international law. It is correct in morally. And it enjoys the support of the global majority, in fact, if you like.
Yeah. Professor Strydom, taking remarks from Antonio Guterres, the UN chief, with the UN Secretary General and multiple states then warning that the US action could set what he calls a dangerous precedent, which also undermines the UN Charter. What specific legal benchmark should scholars and states then use to even evaluate whether this threatens this entire rules-based international order?
It's an important question you're asking. It brings me to another issue that we have in the world in which we live. And South Africa is unfortunately also guilty of it. And that is not to be consistent when we have clear-cut violations of the United Nations Charter principles. And the most sort of recent example was South Africa's stance concerning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has not decided to vote in favor of a General Assembly resolution supported by 141 states, classifying Russia's invasion as a war of aggression under the United Nations Charter. So I think it's time that states start realizing what the effect is of their inconsistent reaction, and there are many other examples, to clear-cut violations of the United Nations Charter. I'm not talking about instances where it's a gray area, and where you have more information to make a decision. But I think that it is important also for regional blocs, like the African Union, the Organization of American States, and perhaps and also the European Union and others, to have a kind of a policy of strategy or a common policy on how to deal with clear-cut violations and how to respond to that. Because by responding to these issues inconsistently, we make a mockery of it. And we create the impression that it's only some states doing this and other states not doing it. And next time, they will react differently. I wonder if we take the states that have argued tonight in the Security Council against the United States intervention, military intervention, and we compare the responses to the time when Russia invaded Ukraine. What do you think we will find? I can guarantee you will not find consistency in the responses to issues that are equally situated under the United Nations Charter. And that is the problem we sit with.
Yeah. Mikatekiso, to extend this a bit further, if the Security Council then fails, for instance, to produce a consensus condemnation due to these veto dynamics that we're discussing with the Prof, what alternative multilateral avenues might South Africa then pursue, for instance, to uphold international law and protect the principle of this sovereign equality?
The tragedy, about, all of this, my brother, is that many, researchers, scholars, experts, practitioners, have been arguing that multilateralism is losing its shine, a little bit. It's losing its effectiveness. The United Nations itself, is losing its effectiveness, and so on. And without the United Nations, what does the world actually really have? Look, states can, come together and form, blocs such as your BRICS bloc, your SCO, and so on and so forth, or maybe defer, to regional, blocs, such as CELAC, such as the African Union, the EU, and so on and so forth, to try, and deal, with resolve issues of dispute, among, member states, and so on, in the absence of the United Nations. But it is a loss, of, the centrality of the United Nations is a magnificent, is a significant tragedy, my brother. The world cannot do without the United Nations. That is why, for example, even the G20, the centrality of the United Nations, is reaffirmed, consistently every year. At the BRICS bloc, the BRICS summits, consistently every year, the centrality of the United Nations, is reaffirmed. Correctly so. It exists because of the failures, of the League of Nations, to be able to, thoroughly or properly engage, in matters of this nature. And without the United Nations, the world would be in, a significant peril.
Yeah. In your legal assessment, Professor Strydom, how might this Security Council meeting then influence future interpretations of the UN Charter, particularly regarding non-interference and collective security mechanisms?
Any decision of this kind by the Security Council has an influence on the development of the law and the interpretation of the law. So it's part of the sources of the law, of international law, because it is empowered under the United Nations Charter to take binding decisions in matters of peace and security. So it is very significant when the Security Council comes out and makes a statement and build that into a resolution that is then which goes forward and becomes a binding resolution. So, and that is often used in interpreting, what should be the position in different circumstances or in a specific set of facts. And in that regard, the resolutions of the Security Council are extremely important in getting to an assessment of what should be the approach to matters that need the attention of the Security Council.
Mikatekiso, I also want to track your views around regional reactions. So many Latin American states and regional organizations have come out to condemn this U.S. operation as a breach of sovereignty, also calling for a de-escalation and respect for international law. What do you make of such statements also being highlighted at the sitting?
All of them have been consistent, about this. All of them, face, the danger, of something similar happening to them. All of them, the whole world, is talking about, how, the significance of this threat, to international peace. There's precedents to this, sort of thing. Yes, it's not the first time that the head of state, is kidnapped, and that sort of thing. However, a flagrant violation of the international law and the display of disdain, for the UN Charter, of disdain of this magnitude, is something that is, quite, worrisome and deeply concerning to everybody, correctly so. There might enormous, implications, of this for everyone, my brother, and the collective, is correct, in responding to this in the manner that they have. For now, I can't see, for instance, any individual country, challenging the United Nations, the United States, on this. I mean, China has spoken in the in the UN Security Council. Russia has also spoken there. But apart from them, I don't see any other country essentially challenging the United States. So all these countries rely on the United Nations Security Council, to bring some sort of sanity, to this mess. There is no other instrument, at this point. And I say this as if, even though I'm also skeptical, about whether or not, the United States will change its behavior even after, this, UN Security Council meeting, whether or not they adopt a resolution to condemn, that action, and so on. I doubt, that it would change the behavior of the United States, but it could at least maybe begin a conversation about the kind of internationalism, the kind of, international order that the world wants, going forward, one that can avoid things like that, things such as, what has just happened to Venezuela right now. A beginning, of a conversation about a new multilateralism, that is better, but that can guarantee the security of everybody, in a better fashion, than what is currently happening.
Yeah. Professor Strydom, similarly, some argue that this situation could weaken these long-established international norms and potentially then embolden other states to intervene unilaterally in future. From a legal institutional standpoint, how fragile are these norms in practice?
Well, they are inherently not fragile because they have normative force. They are made fragile by states not complying with them. And that is the problem we sit with. The situation we have now in the current world is comparable what we had in the 18th and 19th century, okay, where war was an instrument for foreign policy, and where you could sort of take soil from another state and make it your own. This is what we have, and it's absolutely mind-boggling that in the 21st century we could come to this position where there are states, powerful states in the world, deliberately ignoring and undermining the principles that were established and a whole network of rules established after the First World War, and which became part of the United Nations Charter.
Mikatekiso, also interesting is that some global actors have presented this situation as a law enforcement operation rather than a traditional military intervention in that region. Does this classification, for instance, then affect the diplomatic messaging, especially at the UN? And does it set a troubling precedent for future use of force?
My brother, let us look at what has happened. Firstly, you had the complete encirclement of Venezuela, by significant military deployment by the United States. Right? It's the United States military that has been hijacking oil tankers in international waters coming out of Venezuela, right? And even bold publicly saying that they are going to keep their oil to themselves, and so on. Right, you have a virtual blockade of both air and sea of Venezuela, and that's all military. Right, so forgive me, my brother, for being a little skeptical about this argument about law enforcement. This is a military act. This is a military operation, not a law enforcement operation. And in any event, how do you have one law enforcement agency going into a sovereign country and kidnapping the head of state of that of that country, without even following due process as provided for in international law, and this is a military operation. My brother, every asset that you essentially have surrounding Venezuela is a military asset. It's not the police or the FBI of the United States that are flying those submarines. What is it? Piloting those submarines and those captaining those aircraft carriers and so on. Yeah. It's certainly not law enforcement that carried out the bombardment of assets in Venezuela. The infrastructure in Venezuela and lives there in Venezuela. That's not law enforcement. That's military.
Professor Strydom, as we start wrapping up our conversation, looking ahead, are there reforms needed, especially within the UN system, to prevent powerful states from bypassing international law? And how realistic are such reforms in place, or rather in practice currently?
Well, I can just tell you there have been many attempts at changing certain provisions in the United Nations Charter and amending it. And that's a very difficult process for it to be successful. You need also the support of the 5 permanent members to bring about an amendment of the Charter. So depending on what the amendment will be, I can guarantee you it will never go forward. It will never go beyond the veto power. Because any amendment that may touch upon the powers that the 5 permanent members have at this point in time will not succeed. So I'm not talking about minor amendments here and there, procedural issues and so on. That may go through, but not when it touches on the substantive powers of the 5 permanent members.
Similarly, Mikatekiso, let's also get your final thoughts. And as South Africa and other states then position themselves as defenders of multilateralism, international law, and the authority of the UN, for instance, as an organization, what lasting message should the Security Council then, or this critical moment, what should it send about the kind of global order that countries like South Africa are advocating for right now, especially as power politics increasingly test the rules, if you may, rules-based systems that we are seeing?
Well, some have said at this meeting, this evening's meeting, that they've questioned, the purpose of the United Nations Security Council. In fact, the United Nations at all, altogether, if it allows transgressions, such as this of international law, and violations of the UN Charter, right? It's a scary period, my brother, because, powerful states are, just that, powerful states. They've been ignoring, many, of, the provisions of the UN Charter. Some, especially the United States, have been, progressively, shifting away, from the United Nations and, and multilateralism altogether. They've been consistently displaying disdain, for multilateralism since the beginning of last year, January last year, on day one, of the new Trump administration. So it's absolutely vital for the United Nations Security Council right now to be quite resolute, and reaffirm, the UN Charter, to reaffirm, international law, and urge, and insist, on a reversal, of course, from the United States, whether or not it does it, but it's important, for the UN Security Council to actually say so, and provide an opportunity for the international community, now the rest of the world, to actually sit down and say that, hang on, what kind of by international order do we want, going forward? Because clearly, this one, isn't quite, delivering the peace, the international peace that we require. This is, a massive threat, to global security.
Yeah. Prof, as we end our conversation, there are also questions emerging this evening as to what happens next to Venezuela's leader, Nicolás Maduro. There are fears that he might not even be able to go back to his home country. Can you give us any insight into the possibilities of what might happen going forward after he has pleaded not guilty in court?
Yeah, I'm not going to speculate on that because at this point in time, we have no evidence on what is the evidence against him and his wife. So, and that is a court proceeding that will have to run its course in the United States of America under the laws of the United States of America. So we can only make a sort of judgment on that or debate it, whatever the case might be, when we get to that point. So there is simply too much uncertainty at this point in time of how that case will proceed.
Gentlemen, let me thank you so much for your time, Mikatekiso, as well as Professor Hennie Strydom, joining us this evening, giving us their perspective. And this discussion has been quite vital, or a vital exploration of international law, multilateral diplomacy, but also looking at South Africa's own foreign policy at a moment of significant global tension. Really, their insights have helped us unpack the implications of the U.S. action in Venezuela, but also the urgent Security Council response that saw the meeting take place today, as a number of countries have also criticized the U.S.'s actions in Venezuela.